What happens in Russia is important to Ukrainians. What happens in Ukraine is important to Russians. So we could have intervened early on and said, let's have a ceasefire and talk. In fact, we could have listened to the Russians over the last 10, 20 years about their concerns with what was happening inside Ukraine. And I think now we see with this Zelensky regime, a very dangerous government that is incurably hostile to Russia, that responds exclusively to instructions from Washington, that has decided that it wants to fatally weaken Russia in any way possible. The whole thing has backfired, obviously. Russia is actually economically and financially stronger today than it was when the intervention began. I would argue it's becoming stronger with each passing hour militarily. So the solution to this is not to join this futile and pointlessly destructive war with Moscow, is to get some sense into people's minds in the government in Kiev. And the last thing that Warsaw ought to do is join this thing. Warsaw should offer its services to broker an end to this destructive conflict. That's really where Warsaw could play the role of a great power.
We've had high-level Polish military, ex-military officials saying that, it's only a matter of time before Russia runs out of missiles. Russians have to be stealing military equipment from Ukrainians that they don't have their own. They're a rump post-Soviet army. The West is saying the Russians got routed. Well, the Russians are saying, no, it was just a tactical withdrawal, and we're going to come back, and we're going to come back soon.
Well, let's go back to the beginning and understand that the military establishment that Putin and his government built in the last 15 to 20 years was designed preeminently to simply defend Russia. It was not designed for offensive warfare against any neighbors. And I think we failed to see that the reduction in the size of the force and the change in its orientation meant something very different from what existed in Soviet times or even in the Tsarist period. He went in, that is, Mr. Putin went into eastern Ukraine with a set of assumptions that were not valid. But at the time, he thought they were. He said, we don't want to kill civilians. We don't want to destroy infrastructure. In fact, we want to wage a very limited campaign because our principal interest is in eradicating these radical elements in the East, putting an end to the hostile force that is being built up by the United States and NATO in eastern Ukraine, and come to some sort of agreement that would allow for the equal representation before the law for the rights of Russians living in Ukraine. He thought, well, we're fighting a brother Slavic country, and we don't want this to last any longer than absolutely necessary. And I think he believed that he would have a serious negotiating partner in Kiev and in Washington. He was wrong. Everything has now changed. It began changing in the summer. Decisions were made in August about how they would approach the rest of this campaign. And now we're looking at a force of almost 700,000 troops surrounding Ukraine. The large probability of offensives beginning sometime over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 weeks, whenever the ground freezes completely and the Russians judge their force to be ready. And they will move in and they will finish off this Ukrainian state. Let's not kid ourselves. The regime in Kiev is likely to be annihilated along with the remainder of its armed forces, which over time have become more and more radicalized to the point where now these so-called Azov Nazis and their supporters are not only murdering Russians, they're murdering their own people. And as we saw recently, they actually set out to kill Polish troops that were serving in Ukrainian uniform in Ukraine. This thing is gone badly. The Russians have been running out of munitions, I guess, from day one, according to the propaganda, and the Ukrainians are still on their victory march. Well, that's all nonsense. The Russians are now fully mobilizing to complete this task. The biggest mistake we could make in the West is to involve ourselves. We've done enough damage. And I think what we're going to see is exactly what I described, the total destruction of this rump Ukrainian state. Now, what happens afterwards? I don't know. I'm quite confident the Russians do not want to remain in Western Ukraine. That is the Ukrainian heartland. That's where the real Ukrainians live. Russians aren't interested in that. The Russians will likely withdraw to the Dnieper River. But as far as Kherson is concerned, Kherson is part of this thing called Novorossiya, which was always Russian Odessa was founded by Russians, although you could give some credit to Germans, who were certainly in service to Catherine the Great, who had a role in building a lot of these cities, along with some Englishmen, Scots, and Dutch, let's be frank. But the bottom line is it was always Russian. It was never, quote unquote, Ukrainian. The Ukrainian heartland is further north above the Black Sea. The Russians are going to recapture Kherson, and the Russians are going to retake Kharkov. These are historically Russian cities. But the Russians are not interested in the rest of it. I just hope that the Ukrainians allow for some sort of emergence of a new government with a new, fresh attitude so that we can bring this thing to an end, because, frankly, we've let the world down in Washington. This is the first time in our history, certainly since the Second World War, that we have not immediately intervened to end a conflict that would involve Russia. We have always worked tirelessly to find a way out of conflict with Russia. Never before have we had a government that sought conflict with Russia. And the tragedy, of course, is that we've subsidized and built up this tremendous force in eastern Ukraine that was first destroyed, and we've continued to build up whatever is left. And the principal victims are, of course, Ukrainians. They're dying in great numbers. Poles need to understand this. The way forward is not war with Russia. If you look at the strikes, the pattern of strikes that have begun, certainly since General Surovikin took over, they're very different from what we saw previously. In Russia, people were asking in the first months, why haven't you done damage to the bridges? Why haven't you attacked the transportation network? Why haven't you attacked the electric grid, the energy system? Why haven't you gone after all of the Ukrainian military installations? On and on and on. Well, those things are now happening. Ukraine can no longer manufacture any rocket fuel. It's being destroyed. Ukraine is running out of diesel. Ukraine cannot maintain the cities because the power is gone. This is going to continue until really the Ukrainian people are starving, freezing, and hopeless. And then the Russian offensive will begin, and it will be devastating. But they are now treating Ukraine as a real enemy. Previously, they did not. And this is not understood in the West.
The strategic war, the strategic air campaign that was done before the ground troops, and you personally went into Iraq in 91. I mean, it seems to be part of the rules of war. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. And during World War II, the United States Air Force, probably the single most important task that the U.S. Air Force completed was the destruction of the fuel system that essentially made the Wehrmacht dangerous. By the time the Soviets launched Operation Bagration in June, or on or about June 24th, 1944, the Germans had no fuel to speak of. In other words, their aircraft had 2 hours of fuel before they had to shut down and land. When you went on the ground, everything was horse-drawn, not simply because the Germans hadn't fully modernized. They no longer had fuel. They were pulling artillery with horses, and the tanks only had perhaps a day and a half of fuel. This is where Ukraine is now. This is by design. We did it to the Germans. We did it again in the Balkans to the Serbs. This is not a war crime. This is a prudent measure that anyone would take in war. So we're watching the Russians doing exactly what we have done or what we would do.
We know that Putin has been saying from the very beginning that most of this has to do with NATO expansion, or at least stopping NATO expansion. In your opinion, was NATO expansion in 1999 and the later NATO expansions prudent moves on the part of the United States?
No, I don't think it was. And when I was there, this question came up, and there were lots of interesting discussions. And I had the privilege of talking privately to very senior officers in the German military. And I asked them point blank, how do you feel about this? And they all believed strongly that NATO's purpose in Europe was to prevent another war in Europe. That's what they believed. And I said, well, does bringing Poland into NATO help or harm that purpose? And they were convinced that, given what had happened to Poland in the past, bringing Poland into the NATO fold, into this Western alliance, was something that they absolutely were obligated to do to help Poland. And when the question came up, well, what about Polish interest in lands lost during the Second World War? Well, the German attitude was, well, we've come to terms with the losses of territory that we had. I'm sure the Poles will too. Well, at the time, I heard different things from the Poles, and I certainly heard different things from the Hungarians, who continued to talk about the lands of the Crown of St. Stephen. But that was the attitude on the European side. Now, when you move to the American side, there was no thought about history, culture, religion, language, nothing. The American leadership didn't care about any of that. In other words, what Polish Lithuania had been, whatever the Kingdom of Prussia had been, whatever the Kingdom of Hungary was, whatever the Habsburg Empire was, none of that made any difference. There was no willingness to look back to the roots, the origins of people, and understand their interests. And they said, what we are doing is that we are pressing forward in support of a quote unquote democratic revolution that eventually is going to reach Moscow. Well, I remember hearing this and I looked at them and I said, what sort of hallucinogenics are you taking? What about the people that live in these countries? What about their interests? Oh, well, they don't matter. They're going to be happy in this utopian democracy of perfect diversity. It was completely irrational, and that was the American perspective.